It was a cold November night in 1968, and Los Angeles was sleeping under a blanket of yellow streetlights and Pacific fog. The city, that never really slept, was breathing slowly tonight, its boulevards almost empty, its famous neon signs flickering against an empty sky. Sunset Boulevard, usually alive with screaming guitars and dancing crowds, felt like a ghost of itself at 3 in the morning. Most of the clubs had closed. The Whiskey A Go-Go had emptied out hours ago. The Troubadour was dark. Even the late night diners were winding down, their last customers nursing cold coffee and forgotten dreams. But on a quiet stretch of road overlooking a deep concrete ravine, two men were about to meet. One of them was the most famous rock star in the United States of America. The other was a stranger nobody knew. Standing on the wrong side of a railing, looking down at a place from which there was no return. Jim Morrison was 24 years old and already drowning in his own myth. The Doors had just released their third album, and Jim was on top of the world by every measurable standard. He had money. He had fame. He had thousands of women screaming his name every night. He had producers calling, magazines begging for interviews, filmmakers asking him to star in movies. He had everything a young man from Florida could possibly dream of. And yet, on this particular night, Jim was driving alone through the hills above Sunset Boulevard, with no destination, no reason, no plan. Just driving. Because driving was the only thing that quieted the storm in his head. The image the world saw of Jim Morrison was a lie, or at least it was incomplete. The world saw the Lizard King. The world saw the wild frontman who screamed and danced and pushed every boundary he could find. The world saw leather pants and 1,000 hungry eyes and a man who looked like he had been carved from danger itself. But the real Jim Morrison was different. The real Jim was a poet who carried a small leather notebook in his jacket pocket everywhere he went. The real Jim wrote verses in the margins late at night, when nobody was watching. The real Jim was a quiet, lonely young man who had never quite figured out who he was supposed to be. And on this November night, Jim was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep can fix. The kind of tired that settles into your bones when you realize that being everybody's hero is not the same thing as being yourself. He had played a sold-out show 2 nights earlier. He had given everything to the audience. He had screamed until his throat bled and danced until his legs gave out. And when it was over, when the lights came up and the crowd went home, he had felt nothing. Just emptiness. Just the dull echo of cheers that meant nothing because they were not for him. They were for the Lizard King. They were for the costume he wore. Jim slowed his car as he approached a small bridge that arched over a concrete drainage ravine, the kind of forgotten infrastructure that nobody noticed during the day. He had been planning to keep driving. He always kept driving on nights like this, but something made him hit the brakes. There, leaning against the railing on the far side of the bridge, was a man. A stranger, completely alone, his back to the road, his hands gripping the metal rail so tightly his knuckles were white in the moonlight. Even from inside his car, Jim could see the way the man was standing. He had seen that posture before. He had seen it in his own reflection on bad mornings. Jim pulled his car onto the shoulder and turned off the engine. For a long moment, he just sat there watching. He could have driven away. He could have told himself it was none of his business, that the man was probably just stargazing, that strangers do not always need rescuing. But Jim Morrison, despite everything the tabloids said about him, had always been someone who could not look away from another person's pain. He stepped out of the car and closed the door quietly. The man on the bridge did not turn around. Jim walked slowly, his boots making soft sounds against the asphalt, his breath visible in the cold air. When he was about 10 feet away, he stopped. He did not want to startle the stranger. He did not want to make any sudden moves. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, and said the only thing that came to his mind. "Cold night," Jim said softly. The man flinched. He did not turn fully. But Jim could see his face in profile now. He was older than Jim. Maybe 35, maybe 40. He had a beard streaked with gray and tired eyes that had seen too much. He was wearing a thin coat that was clearly not warm enough for the weather. "Go away," the stranger said. His voice was hoarse, like he had been crying or screaming, or maybe both. "I am not really good at going away," Jim replied. He kept his voice gentle, almost casual, like they were just two men chatting at a bus stop. "It is one of my many faults." The stranger did not respond. He just stared down into the ravine below, into the darkness where the concrete ended and a long fall began. Jim took a small step closer. "What is your name?" he asked. "Why do you care?" "Because I am here. And you are here. And it seems like a strange coincidence at 3 in the morning, so we might as well introduce ourselves." Silence. Then, finally, the man whispered, "David. My name is David." "Hello, David. I am Jim." David did not look at him. He probably did not recognize Jim. In the dark, in his state of mind, the most famous rock star in the country was just another voice in the night. "What are you doing out here, Jim?" David asked, and there was something in his voice that was both broken and curious. "Just driving. I do that sometimes. When I cannot sleep." "Why can you not sleep?" Jim hesitated. He had given 1,000 interviews in his short career, and he had lied in almost every single one of them. He had performed his answers. He had given the press what they wanted. But standing on this bridge, talking to a man he did not know, Jim found himself telling the truth for the first time in a long time. "Because I do not know who I am anymore," Jim said quietly. "Everyone thinks they know me. Everyone has an opinion about who I am supposed to be, and every night I go out on stage and pretend to be that person. And every night I come home, and I cannot recognize the man in the mirror." David turned his head slightly. He was looking at Jim now, really looking. "That is a strange thing to say to a stranger. You started it," Jim said with a small, tired smile. "You asked." David let out a sound that was almost a laugh. It was the smallest crack of light in the darkness, but Jim heard it. He held on to it. He took another step closer. "What about you, David? What are you doing out here?" David's grip on the railing tightened again. He did not answer for a long time. The wind picked up and rustled through the dry brush down in the ravine. Somewhere far away, a coyote called out and another answered. "I lost my son," David finally said. The words came out flat, exhausted, as if he had been carrying them for so long that he had forgotten how heavy they were. Jim said nothing. He just listened. "He was 7 years old. Leukemia. We tried everything. The doctors, the hospitals, the experimental treatments. We sold the house. We moved to Los Angeles to be near a specialist. My wife and I, we did everything we could." David's voice cracked, but he kept going. "He died 8 months ago, and then my wife left me. She said she could not look at me anymore because I reminded her of him. And then I lost my job because I could not get out of bed. And then the bank took the apartment. And tonight I just thought, why am I still here? What is the point of any of it? I cannot fix anything. I cannot bring him back. I cannot make her come home. I cannot even pay for a place to sleep. So why am I still here?" Jim listened to every word. He did not interrupt. He did not offer empty comfort. He did not tell David that everything was going to be okay, because Jim Morrison had learned a long time ago that telling people their pain would just disappear was the cruelest lie of all. Instead, when David finished, Jim slowly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his small leather notebook. The notebook was worn at the edges. The cover was scratched from being shoved into pockets and tossed into hotel rooms across the country. Inside were hundreds of poems Jim had written, but never shown to anyone, not to his bandmates, not to his producer, not to the journalists who begged for one new piece of his soul every week. Some of the poems were songs in waiting. Some of them were prayers. Some of them were screams. Some of them were apologies he could never send. Jim flipped through the pages slowly, the moonlight just bright enough for him to read. David watched him with confusion. "What are you doing?" David asked. "I want to read you something," Jim said. "Why?" "Because you told me your story, and I do not have a fix for it. I do not have a solution. I am not a doctor or a priest or a hero, but I have words, and sometimes words are the only thing that can sit with us in the dark." David did not respond. He did not move away from the railing. But he did not turn back to the ravine either. Jim took that as permission. He found the page he was looking for, a poem he had written 6 months earlier on a sleepless night in a hotel room in Detroit. It was a poem he had never intended to publish. It was too personal, too raw. It was about losing his older sister to a sudden illness when he was a child, a loss that the world did not know about because Jim had never spoken of it publicly. He had buried that grief deep, deep in his chest, and the only place it could come out was on the pages of this notebook. Jim took a breath. He began to read. His voice was soft at first, not the booming voice that filled stadiums, not the snarl of the Lizard King, just a quiet, human voice, reading a poem to a stranger on a bridge in the middle of the night. The poem was about a small boy walking through an empty house, calling for someone who was not coming back. It was about the strange way grief lives in the corners of rooms, in the smell of empty pillows, in the silence of dinner tables that used to be loud. It was about how the world keeps moving even when your world has stopped, and how that feels like the cruelest betrayal of all. It was about the ache of waking up every morning and remembering, over and over, that the person you love is gone. As Jim read, David's grip on the railing began to loosen. As Jim read, tears started to slide silently down David's face. As Jim read, the wind seemed to quiet, as if the night itself was listening. Jim reached the final lines of the poem. The lines were not about hope, exactly. They were not about finding peace or moving on, or any of the easy things people say when they do not know what else to say. The lines were simpler than that. They were about the act of staying, about the strange, stubborn, almost holy act of waking up another day, even when you do not want to. About how staying is a gift you give to the people who would miss you. Even if you cannot see them yet, even if they have not been born yet, even if they are just strangers on a bridge in the middle of the night. When Jim finished, the silence was so deep it felt like the world had paused. David was crying openly now. He had let go of the railing with one hand, then with the other. He was still standing on the wrong side, but his hands were free. "Did you write that?" David whispered. "Yes. When, after my sister died, I was 12. I wrote it in pieces over the years. I finished it 6 months ago." David turned slowly. He stepped over the railing, back onto the safe side of the bridge, and his legs gave out beneath him. He sank down onto the cold concrete with his back against the metal, and he wept the way a man weeps when he has been holding the world inside his chest for too long. Jim sat down next to him. He did not say anything. He did not try to make the moment into something it was not. He just sat there on the cold ground, beside a stranger who was no longer a stranger, while the city slept around them and the stars wheeled silently overhead. They sat like that for a long time, maybe an hour, maybe 2. Eventually, Jim helped David to his feet. He walked him back to his car. He drove him to an all-night diner on Ventura Boulevard. He bought him a hot meal, The first one David had eaten in days. They talked until the sun came up. Jim listened to David tell stories about his son, about the boy's laugh, about the way he had loved baseball and dinosaurs and chocolate ice cream. Jim did not interrupt. He just listened. When the sun was finally up and the city was beginning to stir, Jim drove David to a hospital. Not for any physical reason. Jim knew, somehow, that David needed help neither of them could give in a parked car. He waited with him in the lobby. He stayed until David was admitted into a program that would help him through the worst of his grief. Before Jim left, David grabbed his arm. "Why?" David asked. "Why did you stop? Why did you do this?" Jim thought for a moment. He looked tired. He looked younger than his 20, 4 years and older than his 20, 4 years all at once. "Because someone should have stopped for me when I was 12, Jim said quietly. "And nobody did. So I am stopping for you instead." Then Jim Morrison walked out of the hospital and got into his car and drove home. He never told anyone what had happened that night. Not his bandmates. Not his girlfriend. Not the journalists. Not even the people closest to him. The poem he had read on the bridge stayed in his notebook. It was never published. It was never recorded. It was never set to music. Jim Morrison died in Paris 3 years later, at the age of 27. The world mourned him as a rock star, as a poet, as a wild and brilliant and tragic figure. The newspapers wrote about his fame, his demons, his music, his myth. But the world did not know about David. The world did not know about the bridge. The world did not know that on a cold night in November of 1968, the most famous rock star in the United States of America had pulled over on the side of a road and saved a stranger's life with words he had never meant to share. David lived. He survived that night and many nights after it. He went through therapy. He slowly, painfully rebuilt his life. He never remarried. But he became a counselor at a center for grieving parents. He spent the next 40 years helping other people through the kind of darkness he had once stood on the edge of. And every November, on the anniversary of that cold night, David would drive out to that same bridge above Sunset Boulevard. He would stand on the safe side of the railing. He would look down into the ravine. And he would whisper a thank you into the wind. A thank you that was meant for a young man with tired eyes and a leather notebook and a poem he had never published. David never sold the story. He never spoke to a reporter. He never tried to profit from the strange, holy thing that had happened that night. He only told the story once, decades later, to a small group of grieving fathers at a support meeting. He told it because one of the fathers had said, that night, that he did not see the point of going on. And David had looked at him and said, "Let me tell you about the night a stranger stopped for me." He told them the story of Jim Morrison. He told them about the bridge. He told them about the poem. And he told them that sometimes the only thing that saves us is the willingness of another human being to stop, to listen, and to share something true. The poem Jim read on that bridge was never recovered. After Jim's death, his notebook collection was scattered across multiple estates, archives, and private collections. Some of his unpublished work has surfaced over the years, published posthumously in books and tribute albums. But the poem he read to David on that November night has never appeared in any of those collections. Some scholars believe it was lost. Some believe Jim destroyed it because it was too personal. Some believe it still exists, tucked into a notebook somewhere, waiting to be found. David himself only remembered fragments. A line about an empty house. A line about staying. A line about the strange, stubborn act of waking up another day. He never wrote them down, because he felt that the words belonged to that night, to that bridge, to that moment between two strangers who had needed each other without knowing it. The story of Jim Morrison is usually told as a tragedy. He died too young. He drank too much. He pushed too hard. He burned too brightly. And all of that is true. But there is another story, a quieter story, that almost nobody knows. It is the story of a young man who carried a notebook full of poems he was too afraid to share. It is the story of a rock star who pulled over on a cold November night and stopped for a stranger. It is the story of a poem that saved a life and was never published. It is the story of two men sitting on a cold bridge at 3 a.m. While the city slept around them, while the stars turned silently overhead, while a small leather notebook held the words that neither of them knew they needed. Jim Morrison spent his short life looking for something. The fame did not give it to him. The drinking did not give it to him. The screaming crowds did not give it to him. But on that one night, on that one bridge, with that one stranger, Jim Morrison gave away a piece of himself, and in doing so, he found something he had been searching for his entire life. He found that he was not just the Lizard King. He was not just a rock star. He was not just a myth. He was a young man with words, and the words were enough. The words had always been enough. The story of David and Jim is a reminder that we never really know the impact we have on other people. We never really know which words, which moments, which small acts of kindness will become the thing that saves someone's life. We never really know who is standing on a bridge somewhere, waiting for a stranger to stop. Jim Morrison did not save David because he was famous. He saved David because he was willing to stop. He was willing to listen. He was willing to share something true, even when it was hard, even when it was personal, even when it had no audience and no payoff and no reward. He saved David because he was, underneath all the leather and all the legend and all the noise, a poet. A real one. The kind who knew that words can be a form of medicine, and that medicine is most powerful when it is given freely, in the dark, to a stranger, with no expectation of being thanked. If this story moved you, if you have ever been the one standing on a bridge, or if you have ever been the one who stopped for someone else, share this story. Send it to someone who needs to hear it. Because somewhere out there, right now, there is a David standing on a bridge, waiting for a Jim to pull over. And somewhere out there, right now, there is a Jim with a notebook full of words he is too afraid to share. The world needs both of them. The world needs all of us. Stop for the strangers. Share the words. Read the poems. Listen to the stories. Because sometimes the most important thing you will ever do will happen at 3 a.m, on a forgotten bridge, with a stranger whose name you do not yet know. And sometimes, the words that save a life will be the words you were too afraid to say. Subscribe to The Hidden Legacy for more untold stories of the legends who shaped music history. Hit the like button if this story touched you. Leave a comment and tell us about a moment in your life when a stranger's kindness changed everything. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And remember, no matter where you are, no matter how dark the night feels, there is always someone willing to stop. There is always a poem waiting to be read. There is always a reason to stay.